and welcome to this week's talk. So I am your one-off impromptu host for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Before we get on to this week's talk, just some notices, or one notice. So same time, same place next week. We have Tim Smith from the Eden Project talking about the transformative art of kissing frogs. So don't miss that one. This week's speaker needs no introduction because it's your normal host, Yadvinder Malhi, who you'll all be, so needs no introduction. Beyond saying actually perhaps that, of course, at the moment, Yadvinder is head of the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery, which again, I think all of you will be familiar with, or if not, I'm sure we'll be hearing at least a bit about that in the talk, which is a 10-year initiative, very complicated, trying to look at nature recovery in the broad, biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and so on, at multiple locations in the UK and around the world. So bringing all of that together is a pretty complex challenge. Yadvinder's leapt in to fill a breach in the schedule this week and to tell us about some of his ideas about one possible framework to try and do that with energetics, which we're going to hear about through captured sunshine. What can an energetic view of life on Earth tell us about nature decline and recovery? Thanks, Yadvinder.
Right. Thank you, Andy. Yes, it seems to be strange to be the recipient of the introduction. I feel outside displaced. So I'm going to talk about an energy view of life. And this is, as Andy mentioned, quite busy with lots of things at the moment. The Nature Recovery Centre, this multidisciplinary focus on understanding what it takes to deliver nature recovery, how to measure it, what are the challenges and barriers to nature recovery. But within that, I try and keep a few intellectual threads of my own research interests going beyond that. And this is one particular area of ecology that's been interested me for a long time, but what I want to share with you is some of my recent thinking in this area and of why looking at the biosphere as this metabolism of energy can be a useful way of possibly thinking about nature decline and nature recovery. What's happening here? Okay, no, that will pick. Should be now. So we live in a thriving, we're emerging from a thriving, living biosphere on planet Earth. And this has been known in many ways, in many cultures and traditions for quite a long time. But perhaps the first scientist to really capture this concept was a really innovative Soviet scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky, in this book about a century ago now, The Biosphere, which is still a great read. I have a copy of it. And he really recognized that the biosphere wasn't this passive part of the Earth that simply received the gifts of the atmosphere or the oceans or the soils gave it, but the biosphere was this active living membrane on the surface of our planet that shapes the planet, that responds to the planet. So it's this membrane for capturing and storing and transforming solar energy. And that's a very powerful vision. It's a very powerful metaphor, something that we intuitively get when you walk in the forest and look at the ecosystem around you. But what I want to explore in this talk is it more useful than just a powerful metaphor or a way of seeing? Does it actually potentially lead to interesting ways of thinking about nature decline and nature recovery? And one other sub-question of that is, if you look at any image of the biosphere from space, you see green. And so the story of the biosphere at this Earth system scale is dominated by vegetation or possibly by phytoplankton. So the green stuff is what our planetary Earth system models talk about when they talk about the global biosphere models. But we know that the actual biosphere is much, much more rich, more intricate than just vegetation alone. It's all of these animals, let alone microbes and fungi and many other kingdoms of life. So we're everywhere there, but one question I have is, how can we bring in the animal kingdom into our planetary view of the biosphere in a way that's mechanistic and can help us in our global understanding. And I would argue that an energy view of life is a strategy for doing that. So what I'll talk about is applying this energetics approach to thinking about the living world. And why energy? Why not some other metrics that could come up for life, biodiversity or species richness or something like that. They all have their value. I'd say energy is an interesting one to explore because it's something physically meaningful. It's a real unit of something happening in the universe. It's an entity in the universe, and so it's not some sort of a. This is a timer on this, but I'll work with that. It works across all taxa. So there's energy flowing through plants, there's energy flowing through animals, there's energy coming in from the sun. So you're able to compare things across taxa. And also you can relate energy to the power an animal or an organism has, or a group of organisms, to transform ecosystems. The physicist definition of energy is the ability to do work. So the more energy is flowing through an organism or through a group of organisms, the more those organisms are able to transform the environment around them, to shape that environment. And we'll explore that a bit. Starting at the global level, we have a pretty good understanding of the energy going into the biosphere through photosynthesis. This is an image for the terrestrial biosphere. We know about 150 terawatts, million watts of energy are captured through photosynthesis and power the land biosphere. And we also know there are similar story. We have a pretty good idea of what's happening in the marine biosphere as well. Very different patterns controlled by very different factors. But overall, we have a good understanding of what's going in terms of the transformation of solar energy into biological energy. And I'll apologize to my marine colleagues. This is the only marine slide I have, but I got it in there. A lot of the points I make are just as relevant to marine ecosystems. And we're actually beginning to dabble in trying to apply some of these things. My knowledge and speciality is the terrestrial biosphere, so the rest of it is focused on there. But you can apply a lot of this thinking in the marine realm as well. Here's another way of looking at this. And my students and my lab have seen this many times, but it never grows old. So there's the same image from 2 slides back, but here, this is a cartogram. So what we've done here, the size of each pixel reflects the magnitude of that quantity. So this, so the more biological energy is flowing through that pixel, the larger that pixel is. And so this you could think of is a biological view of the land surface. And what you see over the year, the tropics are much bigger. This is already in Mercator projection, so there's already still distortions there as well. If you actually did this on a proper sphere, it would be even more apparent that the tropics really dominate the metabolism of the land surface. If you do this in January, when the UK and other places have shriveled into inconsequential nothingness biologically, you see that we are absolutely dominated by the tropical metabolism overall. That's one of the reasons why I've been so fascinated by the tropics throughout my career. If you go to July, you've had the great greening of the northern hemisphere. So you have something that looks a bit more familiar. The deserts are still shrunk to nothing in terms of biological metabolism, but you can see the metabolism of the land surface, at least, through this approach. And if you do it for every month of the year, you get this seasonal pulsing, the great green heartbeat of the land biosphere, as the energy metabolism shifts from the equator to the higher latitudes and back to the equator over that period. And so that gives you an idea at the planetary scale, the macro picture of the energy, the capture of energy. The first part of Vernadsky's description of the biosphere, the capture and storage of that energy. And so to understand a bit more closer, now I'm going to go into a much finer, more local scale to understand what happens to that captured energy. And we'll start off very locally at Wytham Woods, so just a few miles outside of Oxford. And we've done much work over many years, both here and other sites, of describing where that captured energy is going in terms of the vegetation, in terms of leaves or roots or wood. This is a protocol that we've developed over the last 20 years or so, particularly in tropical rainforest regions, but we also apply it at Wytham and other places where we measure things such as the litter fall from the canopy, the carbon dioxide coming out of the metabolism of trees, the growth of roots in the soil, the properties of leaves, their photosynthetic rates. And there's a whole global network, this GEM network, that has described this from about 60 or 70 places around the world now. But this is the type of diagram we have here, in this case for Wytham Woods. And I won't go through all the details here, but what we have at the top is the total photosynthesis, 23 megagrams or tons of carbon captured in photosynthesis in each hectare of Wytham Woods. A fraction of that ends up in what's called net primary productivity, or NPP. It's the biomass production. The rest is used by the plants themselves in their own metabolism, and CO2 is released by those plants in their own metabolism. And of that NPP, some of it ends up going into fruit and flower, some into stem, some to the roots. There's a lot of richness. We've got diagrams like this for lots of ecosystems around the world now. This also shows that information, the cascade of energy from sunshine. And what we see is about 2.4% of the sunshine is captured as biological energy. We can quantify that for the system. There's gross primary productivity. Of that biological energy, about 2/3 is used by the plants themselves in their own metabolism, and they release CO2 back to the atmosphere. And so only about 1/3 of that is a net primary productivity. So the efficiency is about 36%. Of all that sunshine captured, about 2/3 is used by the plants for their metabolism. 1/3 is used to produce organic matter, and that's the net primary productivity. And then that's allocated into different compartments: the leaves, the flowers, fruit, wood, the ground flora, fine roots, and the mycorrhizae. So lots of distribution of that energy within the system. And we can compare different ecosystems. Here's just a quick comparison. We'll come back to this Borneo site later, comparing an old growth rainforest in Sabah, in Borneo, a logged forest, and the UK forest is Wytham Woods. So firstly, if you look at the actual efficiency of capture, what fraction of sunshine is captured, you actually see, surprisingly, Wytham is more efficient than a rainforest in Borneo. And in doing this, so the high biodiversity of the rainforest doesn't mean that it's better at capturing sunshine overall. It's about 2.4% in Wytham, 2.1% in Wytham. And then, so the other way around. And then if you then look at what fraction of that ends up producing organic material, it's slightly the other way around. The Borneo forest is about 42%, whereas Wytham is around 36%. But they're broadly comparable. It's about 1/3 of that ends up producing organic material. So, but ultimately, the forest in Borneo is much more productive than the forest of Wytham Woods. And the main factor overwhelmingly is the amount of energy available over the year. The fact that there's a long, cold winter with little light. Also, the leaves are shed, so they can't even capture what light there is much of that time. That's the overwhelming factor. There's twice as much sunshine falling in Borneo than there is in Oxfordshire. And that drives the pattern of energy supply in these systems. And so that, up to now, you could call that ecology. I would almost call that ecophysiology, trying to describe what plants do in terms of the capture of energy. But then I think that the focus of this talk is what happens after that stage. Once that energy is captured, how does that cascade through the rest of the ecosystem? And this is really more the ecology, the interactions between organisms once that energy is captured. And this energetic view of ecology is almost as old as the science of ecology. Ecology as a science emerged in the late 19th century. Certainly Elton, one of the founders of ecology, in his work at Wytham and other places, had his idea of introducing the idea of food webs, had this idea of energy flow, nutrient flow between organisms as a core part of his concept. But in terms of a quantitative analysis, the pioneer was probably Ray Lindemann in 1942 in describing this lake system in the US in terms of these flows of energy and metabolism in his work. Sadly, he died very young just after publishing his thesis. But this work has been hugely influential in shaping this field even then. And then in the 50s and 60s, Howard Odum in particular, along with others, really took to this heart, this approach of quantifying energy flow through ecosystems. This is Silver Springs in in the US again, and coming up with these numbers. And there was a surge of activity, particularly in the 60s, early 70s, around this area of work. And it's possible, in my reading of it, a lot of this activity then died down in the 70s and hasn't been taken much further since then. There is still energetics literature in ecology, but not so much since the 70s. And I don't fully understand what exactly happened there. I think to some extent there might be a bit of a big so what, that actually we managed to quantify all these wonderful energy flow diagrams. What does that tell us about managing ecosystems, conserving ecosystems? And there weren't clear answers around that area. It may also be that perhaps other areas of biology, ecology, the DNA revolution, all of these things were happening that seemed a lot more exciting than this, and it just got dropped as a particular area of focus. I'll argue that it's time that we can bring this back into our thinking now. Wytham also was a site of some of this early quantification of systems. In particular, Varley in the 60s tried to assemble the data of Wytham Woods to try and come up with an idea of energy flow in these woods. And one of the advantages of Wytham is that it's been studied by so many people over so long. There's a rich array of data from different academics, different researchers that can potentially feed into this. And what Varley tried to do was a first attempt at this. So this is his diagram from his chapter in 1970, where he took, it's very much biased on what was being studied at Wytham. So you see the oak trees, the winter moth right there in the center, because they had reasonable estimates of that. Earthworms, a few other things, but lots missing as well, because a lot wasn't incorporated into this analysis. But you can see this attempt to try and build this connected diagram for Wytham Woods. And ideally, I think it's time to rebuild that with modern techniques and try and do that. What you can see in this diagram is that invertebrates and insects are at the core of this. This may be the last mention you have of invertebrates in this talk as well, because they are really important. I'm going to focus, but in particular, on birds and mammals and plants, just simply because we have the data to say something more meaningful, while recognizing that there are huge gaps in our understanding, and we need to bring in invertebrates and other components into this analysis. But focusing then on birds and mammals in particular, how do we calculate the energy uptake by animals? Well, one way would be to sit there and watch every deer in the woods as it consumes and what it consumes, how much it does that. And for some things like insect herbivory, actually scanning leaves and how much leaves that have been eaten, that is a viable way of trying to estimate it. But for most larger animals, it's not a viable approach to doing that. So what we have to do is try and estimate that indirectly. And the way we do that is by using the relationships between the size of an animal and how much energy it needs. And that relationship is different, particularly between birds and mammals, or between reptiles, the type of organism in terms of their metabolism. And it varies within a species or between species as well. Some species may be much more active, using more energy than other species for the same body mass. But when we've got a lot of species, this is probably the best thing that we can do. We haven't, unless we do really detailed species-specific studies, it's really hard to get beyond this. And so what we can do is use these equations derived from studies where the energy consumption by different animals has been directly measured, and you get a relationship between energy expenditure and the mass, the body mass of that animal. And that relationship is different for birds than it is for mammals. And then, so we've got, so if we're trying to estimate the energy consumption by a badger, we know it's a badger, but we know the mass of a badger. So then we can, from its mass, from that equation, we can estimate that you need around 5,000 kilojoules of energy per day to be a badger. And then where did it get that energy from? Then talking to our experts, in this case, it was Chris Newnham and David McDonald from Wild Crew. They have a pretty good idea of what badgers eat over the year. On average, it's about 63% earthworms and slugs, 70% arthropods, and particularly in the autumn, fruits as well. And so for each of those items of food, we can work out the assimilation efficiency. How well is that food taken up? So that's a function of what the food is, but also what the consumer is as well, in terms of the assimilation efficiency. And so you can look up tables like this, and you can, this is the efficiency, this mean number here is a percentage. And you can see for most things, the assimilation efficiency is around 80 to 90%. So of the food you eat, about 80 to 90% ends up being absorbed into your metabolism. About 10% ends up being excreted as waste material. The significant exception to this is leaf vegetation. You can see that's about 30%. So if you're eating leaves are generally pretty unpalatable, quite low in nutritional content compared to fruit and other things. And so they have a much lower assimilation efficiency. And so if you know those efficiencies, you can assign them to each of those groups. You can estimate the amount of food required to support that badger over time. And you can see how much it must come from earthworms and arthropods and fruit. And you can ultimately build a diagram that are cascaded through an ecosystem. So that's one badger. And actually, when you work out how, I remember asking this a few years ago, how much energy does it take to make a badger? And the answer is 1.5 moles. But that was it's a physicist joke there, I think, anyway. So if you then the next thing is to know the population density of badgers. So in Wytham, we have quite good studies, and we estimate that our 18-hectare plot is around 20 badgers. And then you need to know a little bit about the behavior of the animal. How much of the diet is actually coming from outside the woods? In this case, badgers often forage in the fields or elsewhere. And also how active or present are they? They may hibernate in winter, so they're not metabolically consuming, active, or they may be migratory species that aren't there all year. So you need that information. And once you have all of that, you can calculate the total food energy consumption per hectare of the badger population, which is 120 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And so for each species, what we need to know are all of these variables. But most of them you can get from the literature or from talking to experts who understand that species. The one measurement you need is simply the population density there. And if you have that and some idea of behavior and dietary preferences, you can estimate the energy flow. So it's not rocket science. It's actually quite straightforward to convert from population surveys into an ecosystem energetics. There are some caveats. Landscape heterogeneity, as I said, animals may not be feeding in the spot that you're studying. They move across landscapes, so you have to think through that. And they also may be eating different things in different landscapes. So in a more disturbed forest, they may be eating different, the diet may shift from what's in an intact forest. And I'll get to that in a moment. And so once we do that, these are the types of results that we get. So this is firstly for mammals. This is for around 2005. So this is based on population densities from Wild Crew, from Chris and David. And we can estimate the total energy flow in Wytham Woods ranked by species. And you can see deer are right at the top there as well. And grey squirrel is second. So if you look at the top four, in 2005, the top 4 animal consumers of energy in Wytham Woods, you see it's a really deer-dominated system. 2/3 of the energy consumed by mammals in Wytham Woods is through deer. The second was the grey squirrel, third the badger, fourth the rabbit. And if you think that the deer at that time were mainly fallow deer as well, introduced by the Romans, reintroduced by the Normans, grey squirrel, non-native species, and the rabbit introduced by the Romans. So much of our energy, it brings this interesting debates about how much nativeness and non-nativeness matters in the shaping our ecosystems. And actually, many of the species that are shaping our ecosystems are non-native species on that historical timescale. So this is a value for 2005. Since 2010, there's been a regular cull of deer in Wytham to reduce numbers to facilitate forest regeneration with mixed success overall in terms of regeneration, but deer numbers have been greatly reduced. So what is but that could perhaps simulate a more intact, trophically intact system where there were large predators reducing deer numbers or changing deer behavior. So if we look at estimated post-cull populations of deer, this is on the right, we have the energy flow. So prior to the cull, we estimate that mammals were consuming 9% of the primary productivity of all the vegetation biomass being created in woods. In the woods, 9% was being consumed by mammals. And only about, but post-cull, we think that's gone down to 3 or 4%. We don't actually have a direct measurement because we haven't measured all the other populations. But if you just take down the deer by that amount and assume there's no compensation in the other populations, this is what roughly you would expect. And so this is post-cull, where you see now the grey squirrel is probably the energetically most influential mammal in the woods as well. But there are others still there, quite significant. We can also do this for the birds as well, from the bird data. And we see that the tits come up top. Given that they're so thoroughly studied at Wytham, I think the birders are probably quite happy that they're also significant in terms of the ecosystem energetics. But and you can see the general list there of species at Wytham. So one thing is this is quite a low number in terms of energy flow compared to the mammals. If you look back a few slides here, we were looking at thousands of kilojoules per meter squared in mammal energy. In the birds, we're looking at 3 or 4. So much less energy flowing through birds than through mammals. And this was quite a surprise. So we wondered, could this be possibly a result of defaunation? The various bird species that have gone extinct in the Holocene through habitat fragmentation or other factors. And so we had a rough look at this. So my colleague Alex Lees at Manchester Metropolitan University, who knows my go-to person on anything to do with birds anywhere in the world. So he pointed us to this paper based on Białowieża National Park in Poland, which is one of the most intact forest ecosystems in Europe, and the Oakle Hornbeam Lime forest there, which is perhaps a proxy of early Holocene Wytham Woods, and then judge whether those species might have occurred in the early Holocene in Britain to see whether that would change our estimate of energy flow in birds. So on the left, we've got the observed Wytham present day. On the right, this counterfactual Wytham with no defaunation in the Holocene. And you see numbers are slightly higher, not hugely higher, but 2 or 3 times higher. And a shift, there's some features there worth pointing out. So as I said, in present day Wytham, the tits dominate. Tits are insectivores. There's arguments that they're probably edge specialist species and their numbers are artificially high, both in the woods because of all the feeding and studying over 70, 80 years and nest boxes, etc. But also generally in the landscape because of all the bird feeders in people's houses, there's general feeding of this population. So it's that supports these insectivores at very high numbers. Whereas the counterfactual Wytham is argued could have been filled with things like finches in particular, the chaffinch and the hawfinch, which is particularly rare now in the UK, almost extinct. But also you see right up in the bird list is the pheasant, an introduced species, highly elevated in numbers artificially by all the feeding of pheasants for the game industry. So you see again, quite an altered, even a relatively intact ecosystem like Wytham Woods is quite altered by decision-making and behavior throughout the hundreds of years or thousands of years overall. So does this counterfactual Wytham explain the low energy flow through birds? And the answer is no. It does increase it by about 30, 40% based on the current values, but we can't explain the low energy flow in Wytham because of simply because of historical defaunation. So we'll turn back to that in a moment and what could explain it. So, but then let's leave Wytham now and let's go to Borneo. You've had a few references to it. Let's go to the other side of the world, to the fantastic, majestic rainforests of Sabah in Borneo, with some of the, with the tallest angiosperm trees in the world there as well, 100-meter tall trees, the very tallest of them. And I want to talk a bit about that rainforest, but also compare it to work that many here, including Andy and others, have been involved in, which is understanding the logged forests in this landscape. So this area has been heavily logged multiple times in the past. Logging in tropical forests doesn't tend to be full clearance of the forests, but it's taking out the timber species, and in particularly in the Asian context, often several times. So deep, several rounds of disturbance of taking out many trees, so deep structural disturbance of the forest. And these forests are quite widely termed degraded forests. And this is a term that's used in UN things such as the reduced emissions from forest degradation. And we wanted to partially question this concept degraded, because labeling something degraded, it can be beneficial if it's an incentive to conserve or restore that ecosystem. and say, well, this is degraded. We need to make it better. But also, it can be a license to label something as of lesser value. And therefore, if you're going to have a farm or something, you can use the degraded lands. We'll keep the pristine intact forest over there, but these are degraded lands already, so it's okay to further convert those. So it can also be assigning a value to something and saying it's more appropriate to do something here, well, as long as we keep the pristine jewel over there intact. So we wanted to interrogate and question this concept of degradation through this energy lens. And if you look in terms of biomass and forest structure, those logged forests are undoubtedly degraded. These are laser scans for LiDAR scans from aircraft or laser bounces off the canopy. And you can see these magnificent forests on the left, these old growth forests, 60 meters tall, trees, mean canopy height, twice as tall as an Amazonian rainforest, for example. Huge amounts of biomass and carbon storage. And these are these heavily logged forests on the right, much loss in biomass, much lower canopy, undoubtedly degraded in terms of carbon stores, in terms of biomass. But how are they in terms of ecological function? And this is an example again of how this energy approach can give some answers to that. So at this site, we were very lucky to work with colleagues at the University of Canterbury in Kent, Matt Strubig and his team, who collected very detailed data from bird surveys and camera traps, from which we could estimate the population density of every bird and every mammal in this landscape, in the intact forest, the logged forests, etc. And we also did our routine measurements of productivity, as I showed earlier. And overall, there's a slight increase in productivity after a forest is logged, but it's not much difference overall. There isn't a decrease, but perhaps a slight decrease in the actual biological material available in that forest. So the question we can ask is how much of this captured energy ends up going through the birds and mammals in this landscape using the approach that I just described in Wytham. This shows you that method again. And so, and this actually revealed a few surprises. So my baseline assumption beforehand was I thought that the logging would cause that the ecological functions will be maintained, so that the animal populations, the energetic flows, and then would collapse in the oil palm. What we found in practice was that in this logged forest, the energy flow was 2.5 times greater than in the old growth forest, both in birds on the left and in mammals on the right. And that was quite a surprise. Also, in this system, you'll notice that the numbers, twice as much energy is flowing through the birds than through the mammals. So very different from Wytham Woods, where 1% was flowing through the birds, 99% through the mammals. So completely different relative energetics there as well. And so, okay, but we've got more energy flow, but is this just like a few generalists taking over the system? An algal bloom in a lake can have more energy flow, but it's not necessarily a more ecologically vibrant ecosystem because of that. So is it a few species taking over the system? This diagram here shows the same results in terms of the different groups. So like insectivores, pink is birds, blue is mammals, and they're pretty small, but the numbers there, S is the number of species in that group. E is another measure of diversity that we use, the distribution of energy into different species. But if you look at those S numbers roughly, you see they're maintained. So for insectivores, it's 28 in the old growth forest. It's gone up 37 in the logged forest. For terrestrial herbivores, 3 in the old growth forest, 4 in the logged forest. So they're certainly not collapsing in most scales, at least for birds and mammals. And in some cases, they're going up. And so we're not seeing a collapse in diversity. Are we seeing a turnover in species? Is it that there may not be an overall collapse in diversity, but there are disturbance-adapted species taking over at the expense of the old growth specialist species, at least in this forest? And there's a nice paper that came out earlier this week that examines it. This is the case of German grasslands, but this idea that relatively old growth systems are slow ecosystems with specialists, not just the plants, but the other aspects that are really slow grow, specialized for slow environments. And the disturbance shifts things to these faster communities that are more fast living overall. And this pattern seems to be repeated throughout the kingdoms of life overall. So it reflects from plants to animals to microbes overall. So you could imagine a situation where you're maintaining numbers of species, but you're getting these fast, thriving species doing well at the expense of the old growth species. But at least in terms of this, for birds and mammals in this system, we're not seeing that pattern. So what this shows is the change in energy intake for species going from the old growth to the logged forest. So things that are in red are showing more high population densities, more consumption in the logged forest than in the old growth forest. And I've just shown the top 20 and the bottom 20 in this ranking. There's lots more in between. But if you notice, there's quite an abrupt jump at the top 20. So if you imagine if I showed the full 100 or so, most of them will be positive red before you start getting to those zeros and those negative blues, just for the bottom 20 or so. So overall, there are only 2 species that showed a significant decline. One of the mouse deers and one of the spiny rats. Most of them are either negligible or a significant increase. So we're not seeing the old growth bird and mammal community losing out in this context. This may not be true for all taxa. Insect, other things may be showing very different patterns as well. So I wouldn't generalize beyond the data we have. But at least in terms of, in this particular case of a non-hunted logged forest, and we're not seeing this loss of all the species from the old growth forest. And this energy approach reveals a surprise there that we weren't expecting. So why is this happening? What's happening is that the plant community is shifting from this very conservative, chemically defended community of an old growth rainforest into a much more fast-growing plant community that's trying to exploit the disturbance, is not prioritizing chemical defense against herbivores and insects in particular, is prioritizing rapid growth. And so suddenly this rainforest that's incredibly chemically defended against herbivory becomes slightly more tasty, becomes more like a salad bowl in some ways. And that increases the herbivores, particularly the arthropod herbivores. There are other factors. There's more vegetation near the ground. So the large animals like the deer and the elephants can access the lights coming down to the ground. There's more palatable food near the ground, so they boom as well. But overall, the system is shifted from a conservative state to a much more dynamic state that increases food supply. And there may be some other factors and predation as well, but we think they're quite small. And so when we look at this forest, which is magnificent, so what I don't want these results to ever say is we should go on logging the remaining old growth forests because we're making them more energetic. There's lots of reasons why the old growth forests are really, really important there at all. But if you look at this forest, what you're seeing is a chemical weapons factory. These leaves have had thousands and millions of years of intense competition between herbivore and plant to maximize chemical defenses. And that pattern breaks down a bit once you disturb the system. And that's what has caused this surge in energy. Is this finding generalizable across other tropical rainforests? And I think the answer is we don't know yet. There may be reasons that Borneo's forests are particularly unpalatable. Dipterocarps, which are the dominant trees, have leaves that are particularly rich in terpenes. Also, they're wind dispersed. So these forests don't have the abundance of fleshy fruit that forests in Congo or Amazonia have as well. So taking out dipterocarps and logging may have a much stronger effect than logging forests elsewhere. So there may be something local there as well. And I think we need a wider data set before we know how widely the principle applies. But I think broadly the principle does apply. The magnitude might vary depending on the local ecological context. So the message from this is that an energy approach can reveal surprising things, that even heavily logged forests can have vibrant ecological networks and functions. Of course, the old growth forest is still immensely important, but what we did want to push here is let's be careful about when we label an ecosystem degraded. What's our value system that's being applied there? In many cases now, I'm sad to say in ecology, in terrestrial ecology, it's biomass and carbon, because that's sort of seen as the resource for tackling climate change, perhaps getting funding into it, into storing ecosystems. And I think the carbonization of ecology is quite a dangerous trend overall in valuing biomass and carbon storage as a singular metric. So the main point is these rules may not apply anywhere, but let's look at the ecology and see what's going on rather than stepping in with our values beforehand and saying that's degraded, that's of lower value than that system over there. Let's see what the ecology is doing in each context. And that applies as much to nature recovery as it applies to nature disturbance and decline. Let's see what are how the ecological functions are building up over time, rather than assigning a value beforehand. And that was the case of logged forests, but I think it applies more widely to human-modified forests of all times and scales, or human-modified ecosystems. So this is a smallholder farm in Nigeria, in this case. We look at this in terms of those classic ecological values of biomass or rare species diversity. We may say that this is a degraded system. As well. But let's look at it in terms of ecological functions. And yes, some things will be lost in that system, but there are probably other things that are possibly even amplified by human activity in that system over time. So let's look at the ecology and see what's happening there. And energetics can provide us one way to look at that. And so if we compare Wytham and Borneo, these two systems, we saw very different patterns of energetics. So this is the amount of percentage of the plant material ending up in mammals. And you can see our Bornean logged forest there, less than 1%, even in the logged forest of the plant material is ending up in mammals. This is the result for Wytham pre-cull. If you go post-cull, you're looking at 3 or 4%, but still much, much more. It can't, and what is causing this? What are the basic rules of life, the assembly of life that explain this difference? And the answer is we don't really know. There's still basic mysteries of why there's so few birds in Wytham and why there's so many mammals in Wytham and so few mammals in Borneo. Certainly predation and those things are part of this, the absence of the top predators, but then maybe but they're probably climatic and biogeographical factors as well. And for birds, we see totally the opposite effect. So this is the fraction of energy entering birds in Borneo and in Wytham Woods. And we see trivial amount in Wytham compared to the fractions going in Borneo. And why is it? Why is it a tropical rainforest? This tropical rainforest, 2/3 dominated by birds over mammals, whereas Wytham is 1% birds. What are the basic rules? We don't know the answer to that question. I think in the case of birds, part of it is certainly to do with seasonality. I think winter is a much stronger filter on bird populations than it is on mammal populations. So the basic climate is a factor that shapes that. If you look at those numbers, that just repeats those numbers overall. Percentage of NPP going into mammals in an old growth forest is less than 1%. In Borneo, in Wytham, it's around 9%. Percentage into birds on the right there, 0.1% in Wytham, so several percent in the old growth forest. So the final bit I want to do, I've talked about energy flow there, but I still haven't talked about how we can relate energy flow to ecosystem functions, how we can describe the energy flow in these different groups. How do we relate that to the functioning animals provide, whether it's seed dispersal or predation or nutrient cycling? And so the final part of my talk, I'm going to talk about some work we've done at a much larger scale now rather than individual sites. This is for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. And what we want to do is look at the ecological intactness, in this case of sub-Saharan Africa, but more globally at a planetary scale. So there are many measures of this. One that's gained a lot of currency in the last decade is this idea of biodiversity intactness, which is a measure of the abundance, the population densities of all the species in an area. And so if typically species have lost about a quarter of their populations, the population density, then the biodiversity intactness is 75%. Compared to a baseline, a protected area. And the Natural History Museum in particular have done some very impressive work, the WWF and others, in producing these global maps of biodiversity intactness based on data extrapolated through models and mapped to a larger scale. And the biodiversity intactness has gained some currency. In fact, the first reason it came to prominence was that this planetary boundaries literature that talks about keeping us within the stable, viable boundaries of the planet, proposed about 10 years ago that biodiversity intactness is one of those planetary boundaries for biosphere integrity. And that kick-started these efforts to map biodiversity intactness at scale. Actually, but last year, there was a bit of a pedaling back. So this paper from last year by Richardson and others from the same planetary boundaries group pedaled back and said, they didn't like biodiversity intactness because the link to Earth system functions remains poorly understood. It's hard to link biodiversity to planetary functions. And it cannot be directly linked to planetary biogeochemical and energy flows relevant for establishing Earth system state. And so they wrote back from that. And there's lots of caveats about the whole planetary boundaries approach. Does it really work for biodiversity? Because biodiversity is always quite local, not planetary. So the questions about it is all, but there was a retreat from using biodiversity intactness because you couldn't link biodiversity to planetary function. I'd like to argue that energy is a way that you can link those two with this example from sub-Saharan Africa. So we use biodiversity intactness. Rather than using those global models, there's a wonderful study led by Haley Clements that's currently in review, where they consulted several, I think it's about 200 local specialists, ecologists in different areas, saying, well, how does conversion to this savanna to this state, or this grassland to this state, how does that affect amphibians or insects or mammals or whatever your specialist area is? And then combining that with land cover maps for Africa, they were able to produce this refined, much more local expert-led map of the biodiversity intactness for Africa. And you can see quite clear patterns. Large parts of West Africa, very low biodiversity intactness. Other areas are higher. I should say the reference point here is a key point here. The way the 100% intactness is based on well-protected areas with an intact ecosystem, where they say, well, this is the most intact that we can find. That's our reference point. Everything else is a reference. And in the literature, that's often assumed to be some sort of pre-industrial, pre-colonial baseline, 16th, 17th century, before lots of changes happened. I think that is a bit problematic. I think there are many places where even the best protected areas have substantially lower biodiversity than they would have had 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, or certainly by 1500. There was substantial loss. So it does have some caveats there overall, but it's the best we can probably do to try and estimate this intactness. And then we use an approach broadly similar to what I described earlier, so I won't go into detail. For each pixel, we use IUCN range map to say what animals should be found there. Then we use the same approach as before: body mass, diet, food assimilation, work out the energy consumption per animal in a pixel. Then we, using an approach pioneered by Luca Santini, we also try and estimate population densities for each animal, for each pixel. He's produced some global estimates for birds and mammals. And then we couple that information to work out the potential flow in an intact sub-Saharan Africa, which is, as I said, is extrapolating from the intact reserves now. That's sort of pseudo definition of intactness. And then also, given the current land use, the realized flow now. So same approach as before, but now applied at an African scale. And this is a paper that's currently in review, led by Ty Loft. And this is the energy flow. So if those intact areas, if Africa was 100% biodiversity intact according to these definitions that I've just said, this is what this study suggests are the energy flows. And these are the current energy flows through birds and mammals in the African landscape. So greatly reduced. This previous one is interesting. Are we seeing there things that are essentially to do with geology and resource supply? So we see the volcanic Rift Valley areas supporting much higher populations than perhaps other more infertile areas. I think that's part of the story. I still think part of the Africa thing there, the West African story there, may be also related to even the most intact reference points in West Africa are quite depleted in biodiversity. So that could artificially say that there's there's low natural population density. So I think there's a deeper historical legacy of deformation that might still be influencing this. But you can see overall really interesting patterns, and overall energy flow in wild African birds and mammals has decreased to 64% of those baseline values. We can look at individual ecosystems. Here's an aggregate for the forest regions of sub-Saharan Africa, and the outer circle is the intact value, and the inner circle is the current mean value found in African forests. And you can see strong role for frugivores there, and previously for large terrestrial herbivores like the forest elephant, but great reduction, particularly in the large herbivores over time. Whereas the arboreal species, particularly the small animals and the fossorial animals, have shown very little decline. Now, we could compare this to the Borneo study I showed earlier, which is a much more local field-based study. And roughly, I've tried to keep the same size scale on the circles here. It's not exact. And you can see some interesting differences. As I mentioned earlier, very few fruiting trees in Borneo. So the frugivores are almost insignificant in Borneo compared to their large role in African forests. So it shows biogeography really matters in shaping energetics. And overall, you see mammals were only about a third of the energy flow in Borneo, but seem to be much more like two-thirds of energy flow in the African forests overall, particularly because there's more frugivores. There's also more large terrestrial herbivores as well, particularly in the intact system. So we're starting to see the biogeography of energy flow coming through there. And it's interesting trying to work out what's going on and why in that area. We can look at grassland ecosystems as well. Much more energy flow in the ground, very little in trees because there are very few trees there, but also previously large flow to terrestrial herbivores like elephants, now greatly reduced on average in these grassland ecosystems. And we could do also arid ecosystems. And the interesting thing there is this, the fossorial, the below ground mammal communities suddenly emerge. There's a lot of uncertainty on that, but they emerge as really, really dominant in these arid systems and are also much less affected by global change as well. So relatively small declines in those systems. And then that's in terms of energy flow. And then the crucial step that we can apply, which we could apply to Wytham or Borneo or other places as well, is then we assign the animals. We identify key ecosystem services provided by animals, such as grazing or apex carnivory or soil disturbance or pollination, and then see which species contribute to that ecosystem service, and then say, then we can sum up the energy flow to that species and say there's so many joules of energy per day flowing through pollination by birds or through soil disturbance by mammals, for example. So we can turn ecosystem services or ecosystem functions, I suppose, better than services, into energy flows, quantitative energy flows. Now, there are some caveats in that. Some animals, for the same body size, some animals will be better at that function than others. Some animals may really disturb soil, or others do a marginal role in there. At the moment, we don't factor in the different efficiencies for animals of the same size in providing an ecosystem function. But that could be, in principle, be added to the analysis. And so then now we can say, not just about biodiversity, but using this energy lens, we can talk about declines in ecological function related to those declines in biodiversity, animal-mediated ecological functions. So we can say that grazing and browsing, the light charts are intact, and the dark ones are current levels. You can see the grazing and browsing functions have decreased hugely in Africa. The seed dispersal decreased a bit. Others, neutral dispersal has decreased a lot. The ones that are dominated by large herbivores, in particular, are the ones that are most affected because they're the most affected groups overall. And the right just shows that as a relative change as well, the relative decline. You can see grazing and browsing, neutral dispersal are the ones that have shown the largest decline, along with apex carnivories, the big predators, the big decline in predators in that landscape. But what this shows you more generally is how you can turn energy into ecological functions, both in decline in this case, but also potentially in terms of recovery as well. And you can do this for a particular landscapes as well. So you can take a particular function like say seed dispersal, and you can see that it's how intact it is in untransformed lands versus in protected areas or in croplands, which is greatly reduced, or in settlements. And you can look at this, the declines in functions and different functions in different land use categories. And so energy is interesting, but it is a little bit more complicated to calculate. You also need to know something about population density. So a key question with this energy thing is that we can't automatically expect people to measure energy everywhere. It's a major work. Can we, from understanding energetics, come up with simpler metrics that actually capture that energy flow? And that could be one of the I mentioned, but it could be other things as well. But ultimately, the approach is if we have a rich understanding of energy flow, then we can work out what's the best metric that, or group of metrics that can be adequate proxies for capturing that ecological richness. So we can look at biodiversity intactness. Is that capturing a decline in ecological functions, energetic intactness? And what we find is for birds, there's a pretty good relationship. Whereas for mammals, there's a lot of scatter. And the main reason for that is that the birds have much smaller range in sizes. So there's actually a reasonable correspondence between the number of birds and the energy flow through birds. Whereas mammals, it makes a huge difference if you're a mole rat or an elephant overall. So there's a much wider range of energy size that makes it the relationship less simple to correspond to look at. And similarly, if you do it in terms of species richness in a landscape and energy flow, the relationship for birds is quite well behaved. For mammals, it's a real mess because which species matters a lot more for mammals than it does for birds. So partially it's the number of bird species, the limited range of body size, and the redundancy in bird species as well. So the particular, but if one particular seed disperser is not there, there's lots of other seed dispersers around that can provide those particular functions. But that was overall, for overall total energy flow. But if you look at particular ecosystem functions and those relationships, you see that there are a range of patterns. There are things that are well behaved, like insectivory by mammals, where actually biodiversity intactness is quite a good proxy for ecosystem function, energy function. There are other functions such as nutrient cycling dominated by large herbivores, apex carnivory dominated by large predators, where there's a tight relationship, but it isn't a simple one-to-one. A few species being lost, like lions or elephants, causes the thing to really deviate away from that one-to-one relationship. So a few species are keystone species, really important, and they break that simple relationship if they're not there. And then the other things like seed dispersal that are quite well behaved, but with a lot of scatter. So there is a correspondence, but there's a lot of variation depending on the body size of the species involved there as well. So how well you can use biodiversity intactness or species richness as a proxy for ecological function depends on the functions you're looking at. So just to wrap up, which species contribute most to the bird or mammal energetics in sub-Saharan Africa? You can see some table there for the different ecosystems, but rather than you looking at squinting your eyes and looking at that in detail, the headline figure is elephants and mole rats. So elephants, especially I find this astounding in the intact, so there's this pre-industrial baseline, elephants were 17% of the mammal biomass of Africa, and about 8% of the energy flow in sub-Saharan Africa. Two species, the forest elephant and the bush elephant, but particularly the bush elephant overall. And now they've declined by 75% in those functions because of the 35% loss in elephant populations since that reference point. But if you also consider that elephants were found in almost all the continents 10,000 years ago, the mammoth, the mastodon, the gomphotheres, and at similar abundances to what they're found in Africa today, or were found a few centuries ago in Africa, how much elephants shaped our biosphere, our terrestrial biosphere, I think is hugely under-recognized overall. Energetically, they were so important as shapers of our planetary metabolism. And then the other surprise is the mole rats. We have a bit more uncertainty. The data is much, much weaker for mole rats, but several species of mole rat. But overall, we estimate that they contribute around 14% of the energy flow in mammals in sub-Saharan, and birds and mammals together in sub-Saharan Africa, and about 5 to 10% of biomass overall, because smaller things have a faster metabolism. So lots of surprises to there as well. So hopefully what I've shown you there is how I think it's time for a revival of energetic thinking in thinking about its applications both to conservation but also to nature recovery. It provides a mechanistic approach to understanding the health and functioning of ecosystems and the biosphere. It brings in animals into ecosystem science, particularly Earth system science, and the way animals are invisible in our understanding of, in many cases, of the Earth system. Energy isn't the answer. I don't want anyone to, I think any single metric of biosphere function has caveats and limitations. Carbon certainly does, biomass certainly does. Energy is another way of looking at things with some power and some advantage, but valuing ecosystems on energy flow alone would also be a mistake. I'm sure it could lead to perverse outcomes, just as valuing ecosystems on carbon does. But it does provide integrated ecosystem level insights into both nature decline and nature recovery, and a few surprises on the way, like what logged forests in Borneo were doing when we actually looked at them energetically. And the unifying nature of energy flow provides a mechanistic way of bringing multiple functions into global biosphere, say, of linking the animal to the planet in a way that hasn't been done before. And so, just to conclude, we can go back to this image. Think of Vernadsky and this vibrant biosphere that not only captures and stores energy, but transforms energy. And what animals and other components that are all about is the transformation of the energy to provide the richness and complexity of the biosphere that we live in. And I think thinking of this energy flow flowing and transforming through this planet is potentially a really interesting way of opening our eyes to the vibrance of our living planet. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Yadvinder. Great mole joke.
That was Ben Sheldon that first made that.
Questions for Yadvinder, but please, for the people online, wait until the mic arrives. Whenever.
Thanks, Yadvinder. That was really excellent. Just a question about Borneo is something I've thought about quite a bit. So we've put out camera traps and found exactly the same thing. Logged forests had recorded much more diversity than old growth ones. But having walked through both, I've always had a sneaky suspicion. And if you went back to that photo of the beautiful old growth forest, you'll see the perennial problem with old growth forest is seeing things are tough because things hide away really effectively. Everything's super covered. The canopy is very thick. And even where we put camera traps, highly biased by decisions the researcher is making, including my own. Whereas in logged forest, much easier trails, animals use those trails. Where we put our cameras, tend to pick up those animals. And so I've always had this really weird fear that the field researchers, myself, was biasing those statistics by where we chose to look and put the cameras.
Yes.
And was resulting in what we're seeing in your presentation. Yeah. What do you think?
That's a very good question. And my colleagues in Kent, and particularly Ollie Wern, they thought a lot about this in setting out. So the models try and allow for differential capture success in different environments and the density of the vegetation and the sight lines of view and things. So I'm not saying it's perfect. It's actually beyond my expertise to even work out, but I know that it's something that is a cause of concern and tries to be compensated for in the calculation algorithms of capturing and densities. For the bird stuff, that is sound and point counts. And I think in some ways that's as easy in the old growth forests as in the logged forests. And we still see the same pattern in the birds as in the mammals. So that gives me some confidence that it isn't a camera trap bias issue that shows it. But it is a good point. We need it for the online.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Two questions about themes you touched on briefly but didn't unpack. One, would you care to guess what's going on with all the invertebrates that you didn't quantify? And one, maybe you could speak to the differences between habitat modification with hunting and habitat modification without hunting, because I guess they might show quite different patterns.
Yes. Okay. Both those. Firstly, while we don't directly measure invertebrates, we can indirectly say something about them because we estimate the abundance of the insectivores, both the birds and the mammals, and that they are the group that do the best in the logged forest in terms of increase in abundance. So our hypothesis there is that what's happening is that the invertebrates are really doing well because all the leaves are so tasty, much higher populations, and that's supporting this higher population of insectivores overall. So not measured directly, but I think that's inferred. We can't see how that population could be supported without a boom in invertebrates. And the other question was around hunting. That's an important one. In the paper, we have in the supplementary, we have a figure where we try and estimate the effects of hunting on the results. If this was a moderately hunted, but selective hunting, or whether it was general snare traps that took out a lot of animals. And certainly that would reasonably heavy hunting would offset the results that we're seeing in terms of enhanced food supply. Probably not cause a decrease, but certainly balance it out as well. So you do see a decline, particularly in the larger species, the more hunted species, with that as well. So, and I think in some ways that's probably the biggest impact of logging is access for hunting. What we're able to do is separate out that effect from the ecosystem vitality effect. But the ecosystem provides more food for animals, but if there's heavy hunting pressure on those animals, the animal population would still decline.
That site is not hunted.
That's very low. Yeah, that's a very low hunting site, yeah, compared to others.
How could this work feed through into recommended policies and action plans? For example, should we bring back elephants to Britain?
I'd love that. Well, I think there's an argument to be made in the right place, but I think more practically, I think we're still obviously working out the detailed science of it, but if you generally apply these principles that we've seen there to UK landscapes, I think it would recognize, part of it is recognizing the landscapes between protected areas as well as having lots of ecological functions and providing a way of identifying and quantifying those functions in a way that brings together all the data. So in the UK, we've got wonderful data on butterflies and plants and other elements. And an energetic framework is a way of bringing them all together and saying, actually, this ecosystem is providing lots of ecological functions that maybe are not always recognized. I think in the medium term with policy, as I said, is then using that to say, well, what are the proxies? If we're in a floodplain meadow, what are the few metrics that we could measure? Which species could we measure that would give us a good proxy for above ground and below ground ecological intactness in that system? So that's where we could go in a few years' time.
Sorry, hand up.
Hand up. A small question about the biodiversity intactness map. I noticed that above the Himalayas, that whole region, which is now the Tibet Autonomous Region, scored very low. And I'm just wondering why that is, because it's very sparsely populated, unless I misread
Yes.
it.
I confess I'm not an expert on that global map. I was just using it. So I wouldn't be able to look at the map just in case I can answer it. Yeah. Yes, I see the Tibetan plateau is relatively low intactness. I think they would have tried to incorporate comparing intact areas or other areas, but I don't know specifically. Yeah, whether there's overgrazing or other elements there or hunting.
It's very low population, so it seems
surprising.
But also interesting, your logging small holding in Nigeria. And of course, floodplain meadows are a very good local example of where human interaction can create very high biodiversity.
Yes, yeah. I think this is one real application of this, of actually showing, sometimes we reference every human modified system to a human-free system, as they're saying, oh, it's somehow lost or degraded. And actually, if you can identify the ecological functions that human-modified systems provide, in many cases, we might find that either enhanced functions or at least unique functions or other elements coming there in their systems.
Yeah, thank you. It was a super interesting presentation. I was just wondering about whether these methods could be used to study kind of the effect of humans on.
I can repeat it as well.
I was wondering if these methods could be used for studying the effect of humans on these kind of metabolic flows. So, for example, you talked about logged forests, and if there's an industry involved there, that's taking energy out of that ecosystem, and whether there's a case for thinking about the kind of industrial flows as well that are involved in those energy transfers. Like, how far could these methods extend into those kind of more political and social metabolic flows?
Yes. Well, it's certainly possible to do that. And actually, it's another strand of work we do look at flows and societal flows of energy as well. So in principle, you could look at that landscape and see what's energy being extracted, say in the oil palm plantations, where is that going? What are the flows around that as well? So you could say the nice thing about energy as a universal currency is that it applies as much to what we're doing in this room now as it does to a phytoplankton in the ocean. We're all consuming and using energy. So it does provide that overlap. Like one obvious one that I think is the next step for us is for Africa, our analysis was entirely on wildlife. And I'd be curious to do an analysis now of how domesticated life in sub-Saharan Africa, to what extent it is compensating some of those functions or not, and which aspects of those functions. That's probably not too difficult an analysis to do. So I think we're going to try and explore to look at that. There's the shifted metabolic flow going from wild to domesticated in that context.
We've got some questions online, I think. Shall we take... Actually, I've left my glasses over there, Steve. Could you...
Sure. I'll just do the top one from Peter Donovan. So the energetics of the water cycle, including heat transfer, dwarfed that of photosynthesis, yet are comprehensively entwined with photosynthesis and biomass. Has your work tried to include water cycle factors?
Certainly, a lot of our early work, when I was more of a plant physiologist in my thinking, is very much coupled to photosynthesis and water use efficiency there as well. In some ways, what we're trying to do now was move away from that focus on vegetation, because there's some ecosystem functions that are dominated by vegetation. Water flow is one of those. Carbon storage is another one. But there's a whole range of ecosystem functions that are dominated by animals, and they get ignored because we didn't have a framework for incorporating them in the same way. So certainly, water flow and vegetation is, in some ways, that's more of a solved problem than energy flow in animals. So there's a large community working on that in different forms for a long time as well.
Right, we can continue the conversation, but perhaps I think that this side of the room was neglected, so perhaps we'll take one more from this side of the room. You've got one there, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you, Yadvinder. That was super interesting. My question is really quite straightforward, but can you capitalize on ecosystem energetics? Should you, what would be the impact? Could you have a mole rat credit? Could this be a way of measuring biodiversity net gain? Is there any evidence of that at the moment?
Well, that opens up a whole panoply of different elements there. And actually, we've just submitted a paper today for Science Policy, which is titled "Resist the Carbonization of Animals." So I think because of all the problems of reducing the complexity of the biosphere to a single metric, in that case, animals. But I think the same would apply to this. I think an energy flow will give us lots of insights, and then perhaps it can be part, if we are thinking of ways of biodiversity credits or something, or biodiversity financing. I'm not inherently opposed to those if it works up that is nuanced and can capture, doesn't end up going down some rabbit hole of a single metric that has perverse outcomes. But I think we'd have to approach it with the same caution. I think energy flow as a measure of ecological vitality might have a real potential compared to just species numbers, for example, overall, but it should never be used on its own without that wider nuance as well.
Okay, thank you, Yadvinder. So we can continue the discussions over some drinks and nibbles in the desert room. But just a final reminder for Tim Smith, same time, same place next week. And then please just join me in thanking Yadvinder. Thanks, Ben.